Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Florence. My name is Sally Watts, and it's my pleasure to be your service leader today. With me, I have two able-bodied individuals helping. I've got Ray Plummery over here to my left on the computer. He'll be queuing up our music and our service today. And behind the camera is Jim McDermott. I wish to thank these two gentlemen very, very much for being here today. Whether at home by yourself or with someone else, many of you are celebrating Easter Sunday or Passover. I hope you get outside to enjoy our Oregon weather. Wave to the folks that you pass by and wish them well on their journey. This is our 5th virtual Sunday. Do you believe that? And we hope you'll sit back and enjoy what we have for you today. You should have received our order of service in the e-blast that was sent out to you recently. Please pause this recording if you need to and go print a copy so you can follow along. The words to Spirit of Life and our peace song, as well as our responsive reading, are included in that printing. We're going to begin our service today with the chalice lighting. The chalice lighting, and I invite my able-bodied cameraman Jim to come forward. These words were written by Dylan Sorrells, and it's titled, "For Holy Days on Which We Recall the Old Stories." For holy days on which we recall the old stories, we light the flame. For Passover, which reminds us of the courage and strength of those seeking freedom in the past, we light the flame. For Easter, today, which reminds us that love is our greatest challenge, we light the flame. For gathering today in this sacred space, we light the flame. For the opportunity to be together as a community, to remember our past, to plan for the future, to be alive and to be present, we light the flame. Blessed be. So, we are now going to begin our service by singing our favorite song, Spirit of Life. It's number 123 in our hymnal. The words are printed on the order of service, and I'm going to invite Ray to cue this up as we sing Spirit of Life. Sing it at home, wherever you are, and join us. Beautiful music by Jeff Lovejoy. Ray? Thank you, Ray, and thank you, Jeff. And finally, we send good wishes to Laura Lee, who wasn't able to be with us today, and we hope she'll be with us at some upcoming Sunday service. So, announcements. We do have a dialogue circle today at noon with our guest, Reverend Stephen Landale. You should have received a Zoom invitation. It's a great way to connect with one another on this special Sunday. A reminder, the board is meeting on April 14th at 3 p.m. If you wish to attend via Zoom as a guest, send Ray an email with general meeting in the subject line. You can send that to his email at canonray13@hotmail.com. So we have our chalice has been lit. We are going to be talking a little bit about our joys and concerns. I haven't received too many this week, but I have a couple to announce. One is we heard from Richard Jones, and his lovely wife Barbara passed away on April 7th, and our thoughts are with Richard and his family at this time. Also, I heard good news from Ruth Bumrocker about our dear friend Peg Peters. She and her husband Bob live up in Portland, and Peg is home safely recuperating from surgery. Now, if you want either of their mailing addresses to send a note, send us an email at florence.unitarian@gmail.com and we'll get that to you, okay? And finally, if you want to reach out to anyone here at FOOF, if you've got a joy or concern for yourself, give us a call. The care committee is ready to hear what that is. Their number is 541-590-2656. Moving right along, we have a responsive reading that we found in our UUA website, and this is called Spring is in all her green glory. And I love this. I thought it was just apropos for a beautiful Easter Sunday, and having spent some time in my garden yesterday. So this is our responsive reading by Lauralee Greenwood Jones. So you're welcome to read along. It's bolded in your program. So here we go. Quick! Look about you! The snows of winter are gone, and the earth has awoken once more.
Hail the spring in all her green glory.
The brave small flowers push up from the warming soil. Birds return from their southerly homes. The first buds appear on the trees.
Our days are full of the songs of the feathered ones. Our nights grow warmer as the sun strengthens.
Warm air caresses us, filled with the scent of fresh earth and 1,000 blooming flowers.
We shrug off the inactivity of colder days and move briskly through the delightful days.
Birth and rebirth, new life from seeming death, the promise of old coming true once again.
The sleeping seeds awaken, the sap rises, everything is renewed.
What was once laid in stillness now bursts forth in riotous activity. Frozen dreams blossom.
Within us and around us, new life is blossoming. Within us and around us, the promise of spring has come.
Happy spring. Having spent so much time in my garden this last few days, it feels really good to see those trees, the cherry blossoms, and all of the forsythia. So I brought some forsythia for you today to enjoy on this Easter Sunday. At this time, I'm going to ask Ray if he could find a wonderful selection that Jeff Lovejoy recorded for us. It's called On the Riverbank. And we're going to turn off the lights here at FOOF. We ask that you do the same at home. Relax and enjoy this beautiful piece called On the Riverbank by our own Jeff Lovejoy. Reminds me of my trip past the Siuslaw River recently, just watching the ebb and the flow, and it's beautiful music, Jeff. Absolutely beautiful. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to turn this over to Ray, who will present to you Reverend Stephen Landale, who recorded this message, coincidentally, on his birthday the other day. So we wish Reverend Landale a happy birthday, as well as everybody else in this particular month. The title of his talk today is called The Resurrection of Peter. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you shortly.
Good morning. It's good to be with you, my friends in Florence. If you celebrate Easter, then I say Happy Easter to you. What unusual timing this is for Easter, the Christian and, well, obviously pagan celebration of rebirth. We are completing today our third full week of the state of Oregon's stay home, stay safe orders to slow the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. 3 weeks, I've often been told, is the time required to establish a new habit, such as a daily walk or a change in diet or sleeping routines. It seems most all of us are forced to change many habits at this time, giving up that weekly breakfast with friends and gathering on Sunday mornings and many more. We're forced to let go of habits we've loved, and we had the opportunity to form new habits, hopefully healthy habits within these limitations. My experiences as a pastor, hospice chaplain, and grief support group facilitator lead me to see this as well. We are grieving. We are grieving losses, even if temporary, though how long is anybody's guess. We're grieving losses of activities and personal contacts with people who give our lives meaning. I think it's very important to name this. We are not only anxious and fearing what may come, but we are grieving. Grieving as individuals and families. And I know you are grieving the loss of your minister, the Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller, along with the temporary loss of your in-person gatherings in a space that has become sacred, or at least very special to you and to me. So how in the world do we get to Happy Easter and feelings of Easter renewal at this time? It turns out that the endings of the gospel stories, the post-resurrection stories of Jesus, can provide some help here. I haven't heard it described this way elsewhere, and certainly not in the Gospels themselves. But it seems to me that following the public execution of their leader and dear friend, the disciples of Jesus went through familiar stages of grief, had visions of Jesus, just as many of my hospice patients and families have had visions of loved ones, and they cared for one another like an informal grief support group. After 50 days on Pentecost, catalyzed by a Holy Spirit of renewal, they had come back to life, in a sense, fully integrating the memory, teachings, and spirit of Jesus. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John tell the story of Jesus in different ways, each with their special emphasis. The Gospels, beginning with Mark, were written approximately 40 to 90 years after the death of Jesus. They were the work of communities more than the work of just an individual. These communities inherited stories from oral traditions as well as written collections of the sayings of Jesus and more. They blended these stories into a narrative story that served as good news. This is the meaning of the word gospel, good news. They shared this good news from their communities to the world around them. Now, painters, authors, poets, movie directors, and artists of all kinds have retold the story of Jesus, using what they have learned in their lives about courage, love, and forgiveness, and picking the portions of the Gospels most relevant to their situation. One of my favorite biblical storytellers is Sophia Foss, the most influential Unitarian religious educator of the 20th century. She inspired me to imagine gospel stories as depicting not supernatural miracles, but miracles of the sort many people have experienced from time to time. Miracles arising from relationship, from paying attention, from courage, and above all, from being receptive to the presence of God at any moment. So now I will share with you a story of my own, a story that I shared with my former UU congregation in Rhode Island, Bell Street Chapel. Years after reading Fa's stories and hearing a UU sermon on this theme by the Reverend Robert Eller Isaacs, my own understanding of the resurrection stories took shape. I call this story the resurrection of Peter. This is an intergenerational story, so if you have any kids or teenagers busy on their phones right now, feel free to invite them or order them or bribe them to join you. Jesus was a Jewish rabbi who lived 2,000 years ago in Israel. He walked around the countryside, visiting small villages, preaching to people, and even healing them. He said lots of things that people remembered, some inspiring, some challenging, and some downright upsetting to many people, such as Jesus telling them to sell all of their possessions and give to the poor. And he did lots of things that upset certain people even more, such as sharing meals with anybody, homeless people, criminals, people from other countries who didn't speak the language. Many religious leaders hated Jesus for this. They said people should eat with their own kind only. After a few years of this ministry, Jesus and his followers decided to go to the big city, Jerusalem, for the Passover holiday. There, Jesus said and did things that were even more challenging to the powerful religious leaders of Jerusalem, but he felt they needed to be said and done. Like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and other brave spiritual leaders, Jesus decided to say these things even though he knew it would cost him his life. Jesus gathered with his friends and followers for a Passover Seder. This was a special and holy occasion for Jesus, but he felt troubled and sad because he had a sense of foreboding that he would soon be killed. He also believed that when the powerful religious leaders turned on him, the crowds would turn on him too, and his followers would become scared and run away. So Jesus began the dinner by taking the matzah bread and saying something unusual. He said, "Do this in memory of me." And he broke the bread into pieces and gave everyone a piece. He continued, "When I am no longer on earth, I will still be with you whenever you break bread together." The disciples looked at each other nervously and asked Jesus what he meant. Jesus predicted that he would be taken away and they would scatter like sheep who have lost their shepherd. His disciple Peter protested, "Even if all the others fall away from you, I will not." Jesus smiled, warmed by Peter's loyalty, but he knew that the situation would be too scary for even Peter. And Peter would say he didn't even know Jesus. Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Peter replied, "No, I will not. Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." That night, some men with weapons came and took Jesus away. He hadn't committed any crime, they said, but in some fancy adult words, they said he had become too big for his britches. He was saying far too many upsetting things, and he should be punished. They took him away to what they called a trial, but it wasn't a fair trial at all. Lots of people came and yelled that Jesus should be killed, and this is the saddest part of the story. Many, many other people got caught up in this anger and yelled nasty things about Jesus, even though they didn't even know him. It was like the way one kid gets picked on at the playground, but even much worse than that. And while people were yelling like this, Peter and the other followers, or disciples as they were called, listened nearby, but were too afraid to stand up for Jesus. A woman came up to Peter and said, "I've seen you before. I saw you walking around with Jesus yesterday. You're one of his followers." And he said, "I don't know what you're talking about." But the woman didn't believe him. She called out in a loud voice, "This man is one of that crazy man's followers." Peter was frightened now because lots of people were looking at him and they might hurt him. A cock crowed. Peter said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And then a man came to Peter and poked him in the chest and said, "You're lying. You're from the same area as him. I can tell by your accent and the way you dress." And Peter said, "I do not know this Jesus. He is nothing to me." And then Peter heard the cock crow for a second time, and he remembered what Jesus said. The people walked away while Peter fell to the ground crying. Peter felt horrible, but he couldn't think of anything he could do to save Jesus. Peter and most of the other disciples kept a distance from Jesus for fear of being hurt along with him, and they even began to avoid each other. Jesus was sentenced to death and killed that very day. Peter spent that night alone, crying and praying in the dark. The next day, Peter came across one of the other disciples, Thomas. They spent a few days together in Jerusalem and then started walking home to their village. By the time they left Jerusalem, the story of Jesus and his execution was being talked about all over the city. Many people now felt bad about Jesus being killed. They thought he was kind and loving and did nothing wrong. Some people even said he was the Messiah, God's special servant, that the stories said would deliver them to freedom. On the road outside of Jerusalem, Peter and Thomas met a woman coming into the city. She said, "What's all this I hear about this Jesus of Nazareth?" And Peter explained to the woman about Jesus being killed and the disappearance of his body. She replied, "He must have been something special for all those greedy high priests to want to kill him. I like him already. Tell me more about him." And so Peter and Thomas sat down by the side of the road with this traveler and told her what Jesus had taught them about loving their neighbors and even loving their enemies. They told her about the stories of Jesus called parables, stories that taught you a new lesson each time you heard them. And they told her about Jesus helping poor people and healing sick people and touching the people nobody else would touch and demanding that we live that way too. And then they started remembering his huge smile, his warm laugh, and the way he could hug you ever so gently one hour and boisterously slap you hard on the back the next. Peter and Thomas almost forgot about their companion entirely as their minds returned to their memories of Jesus. They didn't even notice they were crying and smiling until they saw her crying and smiling too. They talked and laughed and cried some more on the side of the road while people passed by and looked at them curiously. They didn't care. And then the traveler said, "You must be hungry." And she reached into her bag and pulled out some matzah bread. "Here, this is left over from my family Seder. Take and eat." And when the traveler broke the bread and gave it to them, they trembled. They remembered what Jesus said at the last Passover supper. "Jesus is with us," Peter said. And the traveler said, "He is. I feel him with us." And they ate together in silence. It was nightfall when they exchanged hugs and the woman continued to Jerusalem. Peter and Thomas walked a little ways and then found a small tree to sleep under. It was a clear night. They could see thousands of stars. As they prepared to sleep, they didn't talk, each lost in his memories of Jesus. Peter had a dream that night, a dream so powerful it felt real. Jesus stood before him, gentle and warm, the way he looked before he gave you a warm hug rather than a hearty slap on the back. He said, "Peter, do you love me?" Peter replied, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." And Peter knew that he meant, "Take care of my people," because Jesus was no longer alive. Then Jesus asked a second time, "Peter, do you love me?" Peter replied, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Tend my sheep." Then Jesus asked a third time, "Peter, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he remembered denying Jesus 3 times. He replied, "Yes, Jesus, you know that I love you. Even then I loved you, but I was scared." A tear appeared in Jesus' eye as he touched Peter gently on the arm and with that love that was so distinctly his, said, "Feed my sheep." Then Peter found that he was lying down, with the stars faded and the sun beginning to rise. And he was in that space in between dreaming and wakefulness, when you don't know what is real and what is not. And Thomas was beside him and awoke then too, still half living in a dream of his own. Thomas spoke first. "I touched his wounds," he said. And he cried, but he was smiling, like the night before. And Peter said, "He told me to feed his sheep, to continue his work." And then they broke bread together again, smiling. Peter and Thomas returned to Jerusalem, found the other disciples, some of whom had similar experiences, and they shared a meal. They told the others how they met the stranger on the road and how Jesus was known to them in the breaking of the bread. Peter said, "He is with us still, just like he said. He is risen. We are now the body of Christ." Now, the journey from Easter to Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit came to the disciples, was 50 days. That's why it's called Pentecost, Pent for 5 or 50. It was a process. Grieving is a process. The disciples were grieving. It may take a while before we come back to life again. Since I first told the story of the resurrection of Peter, embellishing or riffing on the Gospels in a Sophia Foss-inspired way, I have completed several more years of ministry plus 7 years of hospice chaplaincy and bereavement work. Personally, I've experienced a divorce, the death of my mother, and other losses. The disciples experienced what people often experience when they grieve. Their lives revolved around Jesus the way the earth revolves around the sun. I've had many people show up in grief support groups who lost someone around whom their lives revolved. This is frequently true of spouses, parents, and other family caregivers. When we lose someone who is the center of our world, we feel like we're spinning off into space, disoriented, no longer sure who we are, whose we are, what our lives are all about. Disidentified with our previous role, we are now completely disoriented as well. If the disciples were human beings who loved Jesus and gave up their former lives to follow him, leaving behind their fishing nets and families, there is simply no way they did not experience this disorientation and perhaps even disillusionment for a time. And for Peter, and very likely other of the disciples, there was another dimension of grief. In 3 of the 4 Gospels, it is said that Peter wept bitterly after the cock crowed, and he recalled Jesus' prediction that Peter would deny him 3 times. Even this small level of detail about people's feelings is extremely rare in the New Testament. It jumps out at you. Imagine how Peter felt, really. Jesus was the center of Peter's life. Before Jesus was taken away, Peter couldn't imagine denying he knew Jesus. But then he did exactly that 3 times to save his own skin. And then he saw Jesus publicly executed. There's a clinical phrase to describe things like this. It's called complicated grief. In my observation, most grief is complicated in some way. A woman in one of my grief support groups was grieving the death of her husband. I'll call her Margaret. As she progressed in her grieving, she began recalling the death of their daughter in her early 20s from a car crash. Margaret and her daughter had a close, loving relationship. There was no denials, no angry argument at the end. But there was this. The last time Margaret saw her daughter had just cut her beautiful long hair. Margaret said, "Oh dear, why did you have to cut your beautiful long hair?" She said it lovingly, but still, it was the last thing she said to her before her daughter headed out for the evening, never to return. Decades later, part of her still felt guilty for what she had said. And these feelings, I believe, were never or only rarely expressed until she participated in a grief support group following the death of her husband. Psychologists say that children think that everything bad that happens to them is their fault. Deaths, divorces, everything. This kind of magical thinking applies to certain age groups especially. But it seems to me that this magical thinking never really disappears. We adults are just better at hiding it, especially from ourselves. If we hurt the feelings of our loved one before they died, then it's our fault somehow. It's how feelings work. In the gospel post-resurrection stories, the disciples rediscover Jesus in the breaking of bread with a stranger on a fishing boat and by the sea. Places and situations that would invariably call Jesus in mind, if not in spirit. This is the way it is for us too. Anniversaries, or when we go to a restaurant that we used to go to with a loved one. So when and where do you feel most the presence of those you have loved and lost? And it can take a while to understand more fully who somebody really was in our lives, if not in the world. A woman on hospice care shared of her husband dying decades earlier. They ran a business together, something like farm equipment, frequented by far more men than women. She didn't miss a day, even after he died. For 5 years through her grief, for 5 years, she managed the business by herself. What got you through that time? I asked her. He did, she replied without hesitation. She talked to him aloud every day, and she heard his responses. They had an old shoe marriage. After so many years together, including as business partners, she knew what he would say in any situation, to any question. But it wasn't merely a mental exercise for her. She truly felt her husband responding to her, helping her. So was this experience of hers purely psychological, or did it also have a spiritual dimension? Or does love inhabit our bodies in ways we cannot describe with words? I can't say. But when she told me without hesitation that it was her husband who got her through these years, I believed her. It was something more visceral than my memories of him got me through that time. She experienced him actively engaged with her life, and that's what got her through. Healing and grief rarely comes without tears. You have to feel it to get through it. And we may never be fully healed, but we can find a wholeness amid the brokenness, a grace perhaps, and we can find a greater capacity to find the wholeness amidst the brokenness of others, which can be a grace to them. It's abundantly clear to me that the turning point in Peter's grief is when Jesus asked him 3 times if Peter loved Jesus. Some biblical scholars have called these passages Jesus' punishment of Jesus, a form of discipline necessary to make sure Peter knew that what he did wrong before he could be reinstated as a disciple. But this seems to me nothing like punishment at all. Not all tears are bad. Jesus is helping people affirm his love for Jesus 3 times to let go of his shame at denying him 3 times. And most importantly, he's giving Peter something to do to manifest that love. Feed my sheep. This is a story of Jesus, whether it's Peter's memory of Jesus, an actual spiritual presence, or the love between Peter and Jesus living on in Peter's body. This is a story of Jesus resurrecting Peter, in a sense, bringing him back to life. You may have experienced something like this, if not so dramatic. It's never too late to answer the question, did you love me? More than once, I believe 3 times I asked Margaret of her daughter who died in her 20s, did you love her? Of course I loved her, was her reply with tears. These repeated questions helped her forgive herself, just as they did with Peter. So if you are grieving someone at this time and you feel guilty or regretful about something you left unsaid or undone, or something you wish you could take back, please know that you are not alone as a member of the human species. Find others who feel the same, especially now. I agree with Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, who says that social distancing is not accurate language for our situation. We are physical distancing. We can still be social. We can still explore and reinforce our spirituality together. We can still take care of one another. We can still listen with compassion. When you feel sad or angry or guilt-ridden or any of those other uncomfortable feelings about a loved one who has passed, ask yourself, do you love them? Not just did you love them, but do you love them? You may find that they are more alive to you than you've realized. Honor your love for them. Live out your love for them by loving, caring, working, stewarding the way they did. Feed their sheep. That is resurrection. That is good news. Now more than ever, let's practice resurrection. Amen.
Really wonderful. Thank you, Reverend Landale. And again, I enjoy this message, and I invite you all to join us on our Zoom dialogue circle at noon today, where you might be able to share your story or how his message touched your soul. We'll see you at noon. Next week we have Dean Schrock. I don't know exactly the title of his talk, but we all know it's a pretty good talk. And Carrie Gottfried, our young gal from McMinnville, who will be, or is she Corvallis? I think she's Corvallis. She'll be with us in 2 weeks. So we look forward to both of those. So this is the time in our service when we talk about our offering. I'm reminded that we've been fortunate to have received many contributions and pledge payments of support from our fellowship over the last few weeks. So if and only if you are able, please send us a check after this service. Our address is P.O. Box 2502 in Florence, 97439. Or you can go on our website and contribute through our PayPal account. If none of those options is something you're comfortable with, and as Reverend Barber reminded us last week, find a jar at home, any jar will do, and each week on Sunday take a cash and put it in the jar and save it for the time when you come to be with us in person, okay? The other thing I remind you of is our commitment to Florence Food Share. The folks there, they are our partners for this entire month. We ask for your contributions to them. If you can stop by their facility, I think they may have some abbreviated hours, but stop by with any cash or check. And certainly if you have any food items from your pantry to share, they will be appreciated. So at this time I invite my wonderful co-partner there behind the camera, Jim, to come forward as we extinguish the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. And now, will you please play our peace song, Ray? We're going to sing it together, whether you're at home or whether you're in this space right now. This is our closing song. So if you are able, get close to the person next to you or grasp your own hands in your own heart and let's sing our peace song.
Love as our center,
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you all for being a part of today's service. In closing, I leave you with one final thought that was included in the lovely Living with Spirit booklet that Reverend Ruth left for us. And it goes like this. Rest easy, for our healing is assured. We have nothing to lose but insecurity. And finally, just for the fun of it, from my friend Annie Schmidt, who reminds me that if you hold one glass of wine in one hand and one glass of wine in the other, there's no way you can touch your face and spread the germs. So, blessed be, happy Easter, see you at noon.